I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and we've been talking about the Ray Fisher, Warner Brothers, Cyborg, Justice League, Joss Whedon, Zack Snyder, Geoff Johns, John Berg saga for quite some time here on the channel. We've been following it pretty closely, and until now we hadn't really got any details as to what Ray Fisher's actual allegations or of misconduct on the set of Justice League really were, any of his actual issues. We know he specifically had issues with Joss Whedon, John Berg, Geoff Johns, also with Walter Hamada. In the aftermath of everything that went on with the investigation, he was not happy with that. So we finally do have some of the details regarding, from his perspective, what took place. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of, you can see there's a lot of like miscommunication. I think if people have just talked openly about what was going on, they probably could have avoided a lot of this. A lot of it has to do with Ray bringing the first black superhero, DC comic superhero, to the big screen. Obviously, Ray Fisher took that charge very seriously, and at one point he had a lot more input, a lot more creative say as what was going to happen with Victor in the movie, and that ended up changing significantly when Joss Whedon was brought on board. So I'm going to do my best to cover the significant portions of this. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. I'm not going to cover the Walter Hamada stuff, some of the Warner Brothers executives, which he certainly claims that during the investigation he felt it was more like protecting the executives rather than getting a full-fledged investigation to get the truth out. But there just wouldn't be time. So I'm mostly we're gonna start off by talking about the issues with Joss Whedon, then we'll kind of specifically talk about the Geoff Johns stuff. Obviously, this is a comic book channel. Geoff Johns is a comic book writer that moved over to DC Films, and the Booyah saga, some interesting stuff there. That one's stupid. Just wait till we get to that part. But so I'm going to do my best to break it down, and we'll cover all the information that I can. So this all starts when the studio, Warner Brothers, are unhappy with the reception and box office of Batman versus Superman. And at that time, Justice League had already been shot, and the studio now wanted a lighter touch as far as the DCEU. They being Warner Brothers, asked Snyder to produce a 2-hour cut of the movie, which he did not enjoy doing, but he ultimately did. But then he left the project due to the suicide of his daughter. Obligations were becoming too much. He needed a break. And they brought in Joss Whedon, who obviously had, at that time, directed the most successful superhero crossover ever, the Avengers. Obviously, he did the sequel, Avengers: Age of Ultron, which wasn't very good. But he had done the Avengers. They wanted him to come into Justice League and put that Avengers Midas touch kind of on the Justice League and maybe help right the ship of the DCEU at the time. I imagine they still wanted to save it. And one of the big things that initially comes up was we hear from Chris Terrio, who's the screenwriter with Zack Snyder on Justice League, and the input that Ray Fisher ultimately was having regarding the character of Cyborg. And this is what Chris Terrio had to say. With a white writer and white director, we both thought having the perspective of an actor of color was really important, and Ray is really good with story and character, so he became a partner in creating Victor. So right off the bat, before the change to Joss Whedon, Ray Fisher has a lot of input of what they're going to do with Cyborg on the big screen. What's his character arc going to be? What motivates the character? How is he going to be portrayed? And they obviously take it very seriously, and they were letting him have a lot of input. But that immediately almost goes away when Joss Whedon takes over. And one of the interesting quotes or things that Fisher has to say, that once the filming proceeded with Whedon at the helm, he came to feel that he had to, quote, explain some of the most basic points of what it would be to be offensive to the black community, unquote. So there's friction between Fisher and Whedon, because Fisher feels like, obviously at this point in the production of the film, that he's almost like the voice of the black community on the set. He's the one actor that is black. He's portraying the black character in the movie. He's had creative input, and now he's trying to work with Joss Whedon, perhaps in the similar style to that he was with Zack Snyder, and trying to make things in the movie not be offensive to the black community, which he obviously felt was important. Joss Whedon does not seem to take input nearly as well as Zack Snyder. And then they went into and they had a first meeting, and that's when it became clear to Ray Fisher that basically everything has changed. And one of the big parts was they cut a lot of the Cyborg origin story out, which included a lot of scenes with his mother. If you remember in the movie, it's basically just him and his father. And one of the issues that Ray Fisher had, and this is what he said, quote, the removing the mother piece, it represents that his parents are two genius level black people, and we don't see that every day, unquote. So there was a new type of representation of black characters in films, and that was important to Ray Fisher. And obviously he did not appreciate that those parts of the movie and the origin story were being removed. So we're seeing some clashes between Ray Fisher and Joss Whedon. It gets worse. That's just kind of the beginnings of the issues with Joss Whedon. And it is mentioned within the article that Whedon clashed with basically all the actors on the film. Jeremy Irons had issues, Jason Momoa, Gal Gadot, all specifically mentioned. Also, Charisma Carpenter, we've kind of heard that story from when she was on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. At one point, one of the allegations and one of the issues that Geoff Johns has with Ray Fisher is that he kind of goes to the head of DC Film to air his grievances. But it is specifically mentioned one Justice League star ended up taking her complaints not only to the head of the film studio, but also to the chairman of Warner Brothers. So that would have been elevating their issues even higher than what Ray Fisher had done. And the fact that it's saying her complaints, I'm imagining this must be Gal Gadot. And there's a lot of allegations of what Joss Whedon had done to her on this set of the movie. Very unprofessional stuff. Slamming the director of the Wonder Woman film, claiming that he was going to make her say the lines that would make the character look stupid, while Gal Gadot was looking for synergy between the Wonder Woman movie and the Justice League movie. Was having some issues there. So it's completely clear that Joss Whedon was an asshole. It was very difficult to deal with. And that everybody, not just Ray Fisher, had their issues. Could the issues between Ray Fisher and Joss Whedon be race related? I guess. It all depends on your perspective. From the investigation from Warner Brothers, they say it didn't end, but supporting that is the fact that he had issues with every single person on set. Now, were they all the same issues? I imagine everyone had their own unique issues with Joss Whedon, but it sounds like he was an asshole and he was really hard to deal with. And as a result, Justice League did open up in November 2017. John Byrne, one of the producers that he has a grievance with, but less so than Joss Whedon and Geoff Johns, he exited his job from Warner Brothers in December. Joss Whedon exits his Batgirl project in February following the release of Justice League. And then finally, Geoff Johns departs his position as co-chairman of DC Film in June of 2018. So by the time all this information's come out, all these people are gone. And they have been for quite some time. I believe Joss Whedon might have had still had a project with Warner Brothers up until 2020. Maybe I think it was sometime in 2020, but he ultimately left that. And it has been said that they will never hire him again. Now let's get into the Geoff Johns stuff, because I think there's a lot of poor communication. I think if people just talked to each other about what they were feeling at the time, they probably could have worked this stuff out. I could be wrong. It all depends, I guess, on your perspective. You have to remember that the two people are coming from two different positions. You have Ray Fisher working on his first really big, I'm imagining at the time, assumes this is his breakout project, the film that maybe will launch him to superstardom, maybe get him some more high-profile roles. You have Geoff Johns, who's the co-chairman of DC Films at the time, who's a big producer on the movie, has had years working with these characters, writing these characters, has introduced some of these characters to the team that they're filming at this point. So I'm sure he feels like he has a good grasp on what the DCEU should be and what the Justice League is and Cyborg's place in it. And he's also coming from a position of power. Let's not forget that. I'm sure when you get Ray Fisher and Geoff Johns with his position in a room, there's clearly one person that has more power than the other. And I'm sure that plays a lot into the issues that come up here. So after all these issues that are going on between Whedon and Ray Fisher, he turns to Geoff Johns, who kind of presented himself as a mediator at this point. But this is what Fisher, who's brought up his issues, says that Geoff Johns, quote, said, quote, "We can't make Joss mad." Now, publicist Howard Bragman, who's the spokesman for Geoff Johns, denies that and says, quote, "Johns recalls suggesting that any creative pitches should happen when Joss was not preoccupied, so he would be most receptive," unquote. So it sounds there that Geoff Johns is doing his best to be the mediator. He said, I see what your issues are, but you have to, to bring these things up to Joss when he's in a more receptive mindset. I think we've all worked with bosses that, depending on the look of their face or maybe the way that they're speaking that day, you can tell if that is not the day to bring up the new idea, or maybe an issue that you have with a directive, or maybe a project that's going on that you don't think is going well. That might not be the day to bring it up. You need to bring it up when they're in a better mood. It feels like that's probably what Geoff, or at least from Geoff Johns' perspective, he was trying to do there. Whereas from Ray Fisher's perspective, he was like, well, we just can't make Joss mad. You can't bring up any issues. And then later, Joss Whedon did get involved with some of the issues. Fisher says that Geoff Johns came to him and said it was problematic that Cyborg only smiled twice in the movie. And I remember that the reason Joss Whedon is brought on to Justice League is because they want a more lighthearted tone. So I think that probably plays a big part in this. I don't think this is probably Geoff Johns making this part up. It's probably something that was given to him as a producer. And then Fisher says he later learned from a witness who participated in the investigation that was quite likely interviewed that Johns and other executives, including John Berg and Warner studio chief Toby Emmerich, had discussions that they could not have an angry black man at the center of the film. And then Johns responded that the studio wanted a brighter tone for the film. We've already talked about that. And that, quote, adding joy and hopefulness to all six superheroes, there are always conversations about avoiding any stereotypes of race, gender, or sexuality, unquote. What's interesting, like, I am not a big fan of Justice League, Joss Whedon's Justice League, and I'm not a big fan of Zack Snyder's 4-hour cut, which I do agree is an improvement. But the one thing I will say of Joss Whedon's Justice League is Cyborg is like the heart and soul of that movie. He's the best part of it. That his character arc is the easiest to relate to. I think it's the best executed portion of that film. Now, not wanting to have an angry black man at the heart of the film, I don't, if you're trying to have a more lighthearted tone, I know. So I could see how, from Ray Fisher's perspective, he could be caught off guard with that. There's some weird stuff here that Geoff Johns gives him some really weird advice after this. Ray Fisher is taking some issues. He had a lot to do with the character progression that's already been scrapped. And now they're wanting to play the character of Cyborg differently. And then Johns told Fisher he should play the character less like Frankenstein and more like the kind-hearted Quasimodo. And that Fisher says that in order to demonstrate that, what he wanted, Johns, I guess, dipped his shoulder like to kind of act like Quasimodo. Well, it struck Fisher as a servile posture. And then Ray Fisher said, quote, I didn't have any intention of playing him as a jovial cathedral cleaning individual. This is likely miscommunication. I think Geoff Johns is just trying to pick out two characters that have similar motivations and character arcs as Cyborg in the Justice League movie, and saying, let's lean less into Frankenstein. While he does have a sympathetic arc, not the most sympathetic portrayal of that character, and lead more into a more sympathetic version of that, monster story arc that Cyborg is going to have here. And that way, maybe audiences will respond to that version of the character better. And this is what Geoff Johns' representative had to say. Quote, Geoff gave a note using a fictional character as an example of a sympathetic man who is unhappy and has an inclination to hide from the world, but one whom the audiences root for because he has a courageous heart, unquote. I don't know that that's the best. That was probably a great example. Like, I get where Geoff Johns is going with it. I do think Ray Fisher probably took that one a little bit in the wrong light. Probably not the best advice Geoff Johns has ever given, but I don't think that was so off base, like, or egregious that it needed to be construed as or misconstrued to this level. It doesn't seem like that should have been all that big of a deal. But at that point, Ray Fisher's having a lot of issues with the studio. Joss Whedon's basically destroyed the character that he thought he was going to portray. They're trying to get him to change the portrayal of the character, and he's likely not very happy with things. So I can understand how he might take things a little bit more personally than he probably needed to. So later on, Ray Fisher tells Geoff Johns that it might be one thing for a non-black person to write a character for a comic, but it was another for a black actor to portray that character on screen. Quote, it was like he was assuming how black people would respond rather than taking the advice from the only black person, as far as I know, with any kind of creative impact on the project, unquote, from Ray Fisher. And after that, Ray Fisher says Geoff Johns did not yield, and quote, that was the last creative conversation about anything that Geoff Johns and I had, and after that I knew I was on my own, unquote. Like I said, from the get-go, he had a lot of input on the character from Chris Terrio and Zack Snyder. But then I can also see from Geoff Johns' perspective, he's written Cyborg. He certainly knows the character Cyborg, just as far as the DC Comics universe, certainly better than anyone on set. Better than Joss Whedon, better than Ray Fisher, better than John Berg, probably better than all of them because he's written the character more. And I bet at that point he probably thinks he does have an intimate understanding what the character is as far as the comic book universe, whereas Ray Fisher's looking for it as this is a new portrayal of the character on the big screen. So I could definitely see how those two competing mindsets could probably lead to this kind of conflict. Geoff Johns' representative denies that he ever dismissed comments, adding that Fisher knew Johns, who the spokesman requested that he be identified as Lebanese American. Once you get these allegations of racism in there, everyone's got to not identify as white, I can tell you that. Had evolved traditionally all white DC properties like Shazam, Justice Society of America, and others into diverse groups of heroes in his work as a comic book author. So they're saying, hey, why isn't Geoff Johns getting credit for all the work that he's done, taking these all-white properties and incorporating more diverse groups of characters within them, including heroes? We also get some backup from Chuck Roven, a veteran DC superhero films producer dating back to Batman Begins, and he says, quote, I fully empathize with Ray that his character arc was significantly altered and shortened. I've also collaborated with Geoff over many years and found him to be a gracious and humble man. Geoff took it upon himself to put Cyborg in the Justice League comics in the first place and has written more about the character than any other individual except for the creator. He loves the character Cyborg, unquote. There's somebody that's worked with Geoff Johns in the past is kind of vouching for his character, that, he loves the character Cyborg and he has a vision of what Cyborg is supposed to be in his head. Obviously, it did not mesh with Ray Fisher. Now, there's one interesting part, and this one I am 100% in the camp of Ray Fisher, the Booyah saga. Booyah is something that's in like the Teen Titans Go show that's for like 8-year-old kids. It's not really for adults. Never really been in the comics. And Ray Fisher took exception to the fact that they wanted to incorporate that into the movie because they thought it would be good synergy with the other properties that Warner Brothers had. This is what Ray Fisher says. He didn't see the word in itself, the word Booyah, as an issue, but he thought it played differently in a live-action film than animated. And he thought a black character in pop culture with defining phrases such as Gary Coleman's "What You Talking About, Willis?" Jimmy Walker's "Dynamite," as no one else in the film had a catchphrase. He says it seemed weird to have the only black character say that. I agree. Why would he have the catchphrase? No one else has a catchphrase. It's not like Superman saying up and away, or saying truth, justice, in the American way. Batman's not saying I'm Batman. None of that stuff. I agree with him wholeheartedly, including the Booyah thing is stupid. It made no sense. But when the reshoots are underway, that's when I guess Joss Whedon interjected himself, and he goes up to Ray Fisher and quote says quote, "Jeff tells me Cyborg has a catchphrase," unquote. And then Fisher expressed his objections, and it seemed that the matter was dropped until John Berg, the co-chairman of DC Films and a producer on the project, had this to say at dinner one night, quote, "This is one of the most expensive movies Warner has ever made. What if the CEO of AT&T has a son or daughter, and that son or daughter wants Cyborg to say Booyah in the movie, and we don't have a take of that? I could lose my job," unquote. I would be like, well, that's too bad because it's stupid. But Fisher responded that he knew if he filmed the line, it would end up in the movie. And he expressed skepticism that the film's fate rested on Cyborg saying Booyah. I agree. That was not going to have anything to do with it. He goes to shoot the take, and as he arrived on set, just to give you an idea of who Whedon is and what a dickhead he was, Whedon stretched out his arms and said a line from Hamlet in a mocking tone. This is very mocking. Quote, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you," unquote. In which case, Fisher replied, "Joss, don't, I'm not in the mood." And then after he says the phrase one time for the cameras and he's leaving, Joss Whedon called out, "Nice work, Ray." So he was absolutely a jerk about this. He knew that the guy was doing something he did not feel comfortable with, did not want to do because he did not want it in the movie. I completely agree with Ray Fisher on this one. Booyah was a stupid inclusion and never needed to be in there. So after the fallout of this, in the summer of 2017, obviously the movie comes out in November, Johns asks Ray Fisher to come to the DC offices in Burbank and meet in a conference room. And this is where some more confusion comes in. I think this is just poor communication, or this is things being taken the wrong way, because at this point, probably the relationship is so fractured that everything is going to be taken the wrong way. Ray Fisher apologizes for the conflict with Whedon because he wanted to kind of heal some of the ruptures within the team. Geoff Johns responded by saying that having his agents call Emmerich was just not cool. And then Fisher recalls, quote, "He said, I consider us to be friends, which he knew we were not. And I just don't want you to make a bad name for yourself in the business," unquote. And Fisher takes that as a threat. I think that's legitimately Geoff Johns not reading the room very well and understanding that at this point you're not friends. He doesn't want you to be his mentor. He probably doesn't even want help from you anymore because he's had so many issues with the production at this point. And Geoff Johns is probably trying to look out for him. I imagine he was trying to say, listen, this is your first big break. Do you want to be the guy that created all this noise, had all these complaints? I don't want to see people seeing you in a negative light and you impacting your career. And it was not taken that way at all. So I think that was big time miscommunication. Also, we've got some other allegations that kind of come up here against Geoff Johns. I guess on the TV show Krypton, they were doing some non-traditional casting. And I guess Reggie Jean Page auditioned for the role of Superman's grandfather, but Johns, who was overseeing the project, said Superman couldn't have a black grandfather. And they also say on the set that creators wanted to make one superhero character, Adam Strange, gay or bisexual, and Geoff Johns vetoed that idea as well. I think it would be strange or odd if you had Henry Cavill as Superman and then his grandfather was black. I could see how Geoff Johns came up with that or came to that conclusion. But then again, you are on an alien planet. Maybe the genetics just work differently there. And, if we look at Man of Steel, it's not like people are being birthed normally there. They're not being produced normally. They're being kind of produced in a factory. So you could probably do that, and it really wouldn't be that big a deal. You could explain that one pretty easily. And this is what Geoff Johns' representative had to say about that. Geoff celebrates and supports LGBTQ characters, including Batwoman, who in 2006 was reintroduced as LGBTQ in a comic book series co-written by Johns. And that he's also pitched developing a television show around the first LGBTQ lead DC superhero television series. As for the role of Superman's grandfather, the rep says Johns believed fans expected the character to look like a young Henry Cavill. I could see that one. But you could easily get yourself around that one. Like I said, by the time that Man of Steel comes out, the understanding of the way people are birthed and reproducing on Krypton certainly doesn't preclude anybody from any race being the grandfather, because they're not, they're not doing the horizontal hokey pokey. Let's put it that way. You know what I'm saying? People are generally being manufactured rather than born, kind of thing. Also, writer Nadria Tucker tweeted on February 24th, "I haven't spoken to Geoff Johns since the day of Krypton when he tried to tell me what is and is not a black thing. Tucker told THR that Johns objected when a black female character's hairstyle was changed in scenes that took place on different days. She said, quote, I said black women, we tend to change our hair frequently. It's not weird. It's a black thing, unquote. And then he said, no, it's not. I don't know. That seems like a weird hill to die on, me personally. But maybe as a producer, he felt that it was his job to make sure that there was continuity between haircuts. Geoff Johns spoke and also talks about that. What were standard continuity notes for a scene are being spun in a way that are not only personally offensive to Geoff, but to the people that know who he is, know the work he has done, and know the life he lives, as Geoff has personally seen firsthand the painful effects of racial stereotypes concerning hair and other cultural stereotypes, having been married to a black woman who he was with for a decade, and his second wife, who was Asian American, as well as his son, who was mixed race. There you go. I can understand why Geoff Johns is pretty upset. Once you get these allegations of racial insensitivity, racism, things of that nature, stuck to you, they don't go away, and they could definitely affect your career for a long time. So I can understand why his spokesperson is out there trying to get ahead of these things and frame them a certain way that are more beneficial to Geoff Johns as far as his history with the characters and the way that he's lived his life. So the last thing there, I could definitely see where there's some issues. I think most of this was just a lot of miscommunication. It's things started good. We changed the director to Joss Whedon. Things started going very bad, and then it almost became an untenable situation that everybody was probably going to have a hard time convincing Ray Fisher that point that things weren't going against him. Just looking at everything, it's hard to say that the specific allegations with Ray Fisher and Geoff Johns have anything to do with race. I don't see that for the most part. But from Ray's perspective, he certainly sees that himself. You can see he brings up race quite a few times when he's talking about the story. You can see it's obviously been an interesting few years for him, and he does not appear to regret anything, and he's going to keep doing his thing. And he still does not believe that he has gotten a fair shake, and he wants an apology. I don't know at this point that he's going to get one. I think the execs at Warner Brothers are looking to move on, but we finally have some details, and I'll let you guys decide what you think about it.